Welcome everybody to night one, session one of the Pentateuch. I'm super excited about this course. And Pentateuch is a new word to you. It essentially means Genesis through Deuteronomy. It's the first 5 books of the Old Testament, also called the Torah. We're going to go over the class assignments real quick, and then we're going to dive straight into it. So 20% is class participation. That's being here in the room or watching the sessions online and commenting on them. I need to see the comments if you're an online student or if you missed a class. No comments, no points. I'm sorry. We also have discussion prompts. That's a weekly thing. There is a weekly prompt handout, and it's uploaded to the course for you online students. Essentially, each week, I'm looking for you to pick a style of prompt. So there's 3 different styles. One is looking at types and shadows, basically where Jesus or aspects of Christ are hidden. One is looking at relationship and covenant, and the other looking at highlights and how to apply them to your life. So you'll pick a style, and then you'll use the questions in that style to address the topics that we talked about each week. So they're generic in that respect, and you'll just keep applying them to new content each week. You can use whatever types you want, but I'll just need 4 total by the end of the month. 1 for each week. There are weekly quizzes. These are based off of the class sessions and my instructor notes, which are uploaded weekly. My first set of instructor notes is already attached to the course. And there is an extra credit assignment for bonus up to 10%. And essentially that would be select one of the discussion prompts and expand that into a 2-page essay. I would like you to use scripture in there where you can to support your answers or your ideas. And if you are a graduate student, then you have an additional paper, and if you look at your graduate syllabus specifically, then it has those details.
Yes.
And any questions on any of that? All right?
Yes. Quizzes. You're just going to upload 1 weekly quiz? They're
Yes.
not all available?
They're not all available yet, as I'm finishing writing them per session, plus they're based off the session.
Okay.
But they'll be uploaded by your session. So the first one is already open. So you can take it tonight or tomorrow.
So each week there'll be one open?
Yep, each one there'll be one open, and they'll be opened by the actual night of the class. So you can take it immediately. You'll have a full week for each one.
Perfect, thank you.
Yep.
That's good.
So our intro to the Pentateuch, what is it? The Pentateuch, as we mentioned before, they're the books of the Old Testament that focus on essentially the creation of the world, the selection of God's chosen people, the Israelites, and the origin of God's covenant with them. The Pentateuch includes the following books, which are Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. What is the Pentateuch about? The books within the Pentateuch, they cover the following time periods: the period of creation, the development of nations, the patriarchal period, the Exodus, and the wilderness journey to the Promised Land. The underlying focus of these books is to detail the origins of the world, of sin, of Israel as God's holy nation, and God's covenant with Israel. And spiritually, these books show us how both individuals and nations related to God, and what became of their legacies, as well as how God's promises found fulfillment. Why should we study the Pentateuch? Well, the Pentateuch leads us through the history of God's relationship with man, and specifically focuses on his relationship with the Israelites. As believers, we've been grafted into the family of Abraham, so what happened to them is of importance to us, because they are the origin and the predecessor of the church. And because God is the same yesterday, today, and forever, there are things that we can learn about him and how he relates to man, how he desires us to relate to him by looking at history. And that's the fantastic part, is that all of this is history.
Sorry.
No worries.
I don't know.
And finally, this is what our roadmap is going to look like for the course. I had contemplated separating the narratives from the instructions, but the more that I studied and went into this, I'm just going to leave it in its exact chronological order, because the narratives create the context for the instructions and case laws and other things that were created. So we're going to go through it exactly as is and get to discuss it from there. So that is the idea. And without further ado, we're going to jump straight into Genesis. So many of us are familiar with the idea of creation and that God created the world in 6 days. Each day, God continued to create a different thing, and on the seventh day, he rested. Some takeaways that are seen in that is an understanding of what is meant by the phrase being made in the image of God. And that's the idea that even though we're imperfect, we are made with God's nature. We're given the communicable attributes of intelligence, knowledge, spiritual understanding, creativity, wisdom, love, compassion, holiness, justice, and the like. That is what it means to be made in the image of God. That was how humanity was from the start. When you look at the Sabbath and the fact that God went ahead and set apart this day for Sabbath, the Hebrew word that it comes from means to be holy, to be set apart, distinct. Traditionally, this word would be translated as sanctified. So this day is being set apart, declared for a special purpose. So with everything else that was there is something holy that God sees about rest. Through the fall, that idea of Sabbath was sadly going to be lost. And as new believers with our relationship in Christ, it's something that we're able to tap into and experience. It's more often than not a roller coaster of being in that position of rest. But there will come a point in time when you have your new heaven, new earth, and everything is fulfilled and consummated in Christ, where the Sabbath, as it was always originally intended to be, will be again. The story of Genesis through Deuteronomy is truly a story. It is a story about God and his desire to create humanity so that he could have a relationship with humanity. And that's essentially the core that we're going to be evaluating everything in this course. There may be certain details that don't catch as much attention and things that seem to get a lot of attention. And that's because they're being filtered based on that overarching and core theme of God's relationship with man and his restoration and redemption of man through these books. So, as Genesis talks about, God created Adam and Eve and he breathed his very life into them. He breathed that essence. That's part of what gave him that nature to be created in the image of man. And he had them placed in the Garden of Eden, a perfect environment where they could walk with him, they could fellowship with him like no one had experienced before, like we will eventually get to experience in the future. And with it, there is actually the first commandment, and that's relates to the trees. The garden, in the garden, you had your two trees, the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and the tree of life. And they were not to go ahead and eat from those trees. Simple and one commandment. So already from the beginning, there's the idea that you have relationship coinciding with obedience from the very beginning. And that's what there was. The cool thing is that man, Adam, he's created in the garden, and typically verses are translated to say that he was placed in the garden to tend and watch over it. This usually makes Adam sound like a gardener. But the two words, abad and shamar, which are translated tend or watch, change the meaning. Abad, in future Old Testament, is translated as serve. And it's translated as serve throughout the Pentateuch. And it's used of serving the Lord, and it's typically used in connection to the Levites, who would be the priesthood, as they served in the tabernacle. So again, you have this link with sanctuary and God's presence, and Adam being called to serve as the Levites served. Shamar is translated to keep, as in both keeping commandments, observing spiritual duties that God would place on him, but also to keep watch, to guard and protect. So from the get-go, Adam was placed in this garden to fellowship with God, to commune and to serve, in the Lord's presence, but also to guard that garden. Then God created woman. He went and created a helper. And what's neat is that word that's translated helper, it's frequently used of God in how he helps us. The context indicates that woman would supply man what he lacked, and he would also supply what she lacked. Together, they would create the fuller image of God. For those of you who are familiar with the beginning of Genesis, sadly, they would encounter the temptation, and Adam and Eve would fall. In the garden, Satan came in the form of a snake. And he tempted Eve and essentially Adam by putting doubt in their mind. He got them to doubt whether God really had their best interest in mind. If God was hiding things from them, he was keeping things back from them. He didn't go so far as to say God was bad. Something like that, something so blatant would raise red flags. All he had to do was sow doubt, because he wanted to separate and remove this relationship that Adam and Eve had with God in this perfect environment. The snake in the future would then become a symbol and reminder of the curse, because it had represented the tempter. What's neat is that when you look forward toward the promises of new creation, the serpent will be rendered harmless as a sign that the curse is lifted instead. I'm having trouble with the mouse. For whatever reason, it wanted to switch directions from where I was scrolling. As a result of that sin, mankind felt separation from God for the first time. God went walking through the garden as he customarily did, and this time Adam and Eve didn't feel that safety and that vulnerability with God. They didn't even feel it with each other. The nakedness that they had and that they describe is not a sensual thing in the Garden of Eden in that state of perfection. The fact that they were able to be naked in front of each other shows that they were 100% comfortable in their own skin. There was no fear of exploitation. There was no fear of shame, what the other person could do. It's the epitome of them being comfortable in their own skin and with each other. There was no fear of anything. And as soon as sin crept in and that separation was felt, that is where the shame and the fear suddenly came in, where they then had to hide themselves from each other, and then they attempted to hide from God. God called out to them, where they were. He knew where they were. It was to get them to think about, where are you right now? So many times you'll see throughout the Old Testament, throughout the Pentateuch, as we cover, that God will ask questions that he already knows the answers to. And he's asking them, which makes us, when we study the Bible, we have to ask, okay, if he already knows the answer, why is he asking? And oftentimes he's asking because when you say something out loud, you think about it a different way. You think about it with more clarity. He needs them to say the answer so that way they realize where they are. They offer their different explanations. It turns into the blame game as blame is shifted here, shifted there. You made this woman, she gave me the fruit. You made that snake and he told me to do it. But the simple question that God asked was cut and clear. He simply asked, did you eat? The intention did not matter. God cut straight clear to the chase. It was, did you eat? And in truth, if they had any question about God's intention, they could have asked him before they ate the fruit. Communication, just like in any relationship, if they had communicated with their lover, with God, that moment could have been avoided. But there was a feeling of mistrust to where maybe they didn't think they would know what the answer would be or if they would even trust the answer. So they stepped out and thought they had to figure it out in their own way. What would result would then be curses upon the land. And it wasn't God saying, how dare you? I'm about to make life terrible and miserable for you. That separation now caused a removal where he was now in everything and they were one as one could be. That was lost. So the ground was going to be harder to get their resources from. There was going to be strife in their relationship between Adam and Eve, where there would be authority and vyings between the two of them, where authority and who was in charge or who was the head of the household wasn't even a discussion in the Garden of Eden. It wasn't needed. No one even needed to think of something like that. But now it was going to be. And finally they were removed from the garden. They were removed from that sanctuary that they were originally set over to guard. For they had failed in that. But it wasn't in and of itself a punishment. God removed them from that garden as an act to save them, because in it was that other tree, the tree of eternal life. And if they ate from that, they would be locked eternally in that sinful state. And in order for Jesus to come as man and die, man had to be able to die as well.
And if they had eaten from that tree, they would not have been able to die.
No, they would have been eternally separated from God, automatically. Because there would be no way for there to be a blood representative.
And so you're saying that they were banished from the garden for their salvation.
They were removed for their protection.
Yeah.
And the scriptures very clearly states that they are removed because they may eat of the tree of life. So it's one that's known, it's not even one to figure out and is a mystery. They were removed to save them. That then poured into the family. You start to see sin enter. With their children, you see murder happen for the first time. As one son is chasing after God, and when it's time to bring their sacrifices and worship to God and bring their produce, Abel acts in faith, seeking to please God. By contrast, Cain only performs a ritual duty, and his heart is not in it. And God is a judger of the heart, not just of the action. So God accepts Abel's offering, but rejects Cain's. And Cain, rather than repent and realize, okay, I need to change my heart, out of bitter jealousy, he murders his brother. Cain then fears that because he's killed his brother, other people will kill him. And this is incredible. This is the beginning of what can be called common grace. The idea of God blessing people whether or not, no matter how their life is living, because he puts a mark on Cain that will warn anybody else who would try to avenge and kill him, even though Cain is fully in the wrong. Simply because God is that good and that merciful. By Genesis chapter 4, we read the amazing report that people have begun to worship God by name. So in the midst of this, that worship aspect was not lost. There's been separation, and now there is an effort and a distance to cross for mankind. But there's still the remembrance of the name of Yahweh. And mankind, alive at that time, is worshiping him by that name. And throughout from this point forward, God will continue to reveal more and more about who he is. In Genesis chapter 5, there's the genealogy that gets you from Adam to Noah. You guys have a fun resource that was printed out and it's uploaded online to show you the overlap of those main 10 generations, because it's fun to see how many people were alive at the same time, what was happening. And there's an interesting person on there in particular, essentially when he dies, and I'll touch on that in a moment. If you find him beforehand, it'll give you something to think about. Essentially, as time and history goes on, while there's people who are beginning to walk with God like Enoch, where you see a difference of term to where there's people who are living with God, and now you're finding there's people who are walking with God. There's people who are chasing God so much that they're walking as Adam and Eve walked with God. There is a true, genuine, intimate relationship between some of these people. For the rest of humanity, though, corruption sets in so strong that in Genesis chapter 6, verse 6, we read the translated phrase that God was sorry he ever made them. What's important to know about this statement is that this is an anthropomorphic expression used to convey the intensity of grief that God felt over sin in the earth. The statement does not mean that God changed his mind about ever having created humanity in the first place, because we know that God does not change. We read that in Malachi chapter 3, verse 6. Rather, this is a human attempt by human writers using a human expression to communicate the sorrow of God. It is a sorrow so deep, it is as if he is regretting that he had made humanity. And that is something that we'll also find throughout this, is there are at times where anthropomorphic expressions have to be used, and that's where some people can look and say, oh, there's contradictions here in the Bible. But the truth is, this is the human language being taken as far as it can go, but not enough, because you're trying to describe God with human words. So, God, as he does, he sets in a plan to save humanity, to restart and keep this covenant going, because his mission is not done. He is not done with this relationship, because he is moving toward, he wants this relationship and he wants man fully redeemed, because from garden, he laid hint that there would be man that would come from woman who would crush the head of the serpent. There would be someone who would crush the curse of sin. And God was going to see that plan through because of his love for humanity. So God commissions Noah, one righteous man in his family, and he calls him to build an ark. The ark takes him approximately, from what you can see, almost 100 years. 100 years. Him building and believing and building this ark, building this huge boat when it hasn't even ever rained before. If you wanted to think of the idea of someone who looked like a lunatic, Noah was the biggest lunatic that any of these guys had ever seen. What the heck is rain? You're saying water is going to come from the sky? Water comes from the ground. It comes from the ocean. Why would water show up in the sky? Who's going to put it in the sky? You can only imagine the questions that went around. But Noah does not quit, no matter how silly it looks, no matter how crazy it looks. He follows God in faith for 100 years, him and his family building this ark. And God puts them in it and protects it. And if you map out the months for how long the flood took from beginning to end, it takes over a year, the process, before they're on dry ground again and they've come out of the boat. And if you've been in Kids Church at all, you know that God then promises that he'll never again wipe out humanity with a flood, and he uses the rainbow as a sign. It is a sign of his covenant. This is the first, essentially official covenant aside from his initial relationship with Adam and Eve that we see. A covenant, for those of you who aren't as familiar with the term, is an agreement, a treaty, or a pact between two parties, which both parties swear to by oath to observe. And covenants usually have a sign that serves as a perpetual reminder for both sides that the covenant is being kept. In this moment, in this point in time in history, the covenant is unconditional. God is simply promising what he will do, and it is also universal, because it includes all of creation and every person who will ever come from Noah forward. Because all of us, right here in this room right now, and anyone in the world, can track their ancestry back to Noah. So this being made with Noah becomes 100% universal for everyone going forward, as a covenant with all the world, with the rainbow as a sign of God's faithfulness. He initiated it on his own, out of love, out of mercy, and made it with everyone. Yes?
So everybody up to Noah is a child of Adam, right? Not Noah.
Out of those they are descendants. So some of these branch off and they have their brothers and sisters and those. The 10 that you see on that chart are essentially the family heads. So Adam and a son of his, that it's the specific line that gets from Adam to Noah, and then Noah, everyone else. So,
right, but like Seth, Enoch, Kenan, those are all...
They're essentially the firstborns. Here's the firstborn's line down.
Right,
and
between Adam and Eve.
Between Adam and Noah.
No.
And Adam and Noah's father were alive at the same time. You have 9 generations of people who are alive at the same time during this unprecedented period of time. That's why I laid that out for you guys to see. You have 9 people alive at the same time.
That's what I'm looking at. I'm trying to like line everything up here.
Yeah. So the one that I pointed out, and I waited until I got to the flood, Methuselah, he's known as he's the man who lived the longest. He's the oldest man who ever lived. I made that chart in part because I wanted to see if anybody's year stopped at the flood. And Methuselah's does. The flood started, the waters came in the second month of the year. So it leads you to wonder, either A, Methuselah died in the first 4 weeks of that year and just missed the flood by the skin of his teeth. Or, though Methuselah was the longest man who ever lived, he actually was not walking that closely and was that mixed up in the depravity that he died in the flood.
Yeah.
Because everybody else dies long before.
Everybody.
He's the
only
only
Noah's
one.
family.
He's the only one who, only Noah's family. Methuselah, out of those names, is the only one that you can confirm in the year of his death is the exact year of the flood. So that's where it's interesting to think about. That's where I said either A, he died 1 to 4
So this
weeks
969 is the year of the flood.
969 is how old he is.
Okay.
From the hypothetical point. So essentially,
We don't really know the
You don't know the exact year of it starting, but you know that Noah was 600 when the flood started. So all you have to do is figure out how old everybody is when Noah is 600. And all those people are dead except for Methuselah, who dies the year that Noah is 600, turns 600. So, those are fun things to ponder. Yeah.
Okay, so the numbers are how old they were.
The numbers are how old they were.
Okay.
Their ages.
Okay.
If you look and you pull up Genesis chapter 5, then you can see that at 130 so and so begot so and so. So that's where you're able to get at 130 this person's born starting at 0 and keep going with each person.
So Methuselah dying the year of the flood. What is your take on that?
So my take is there's only 2 options. Either he died in the first 4 weeks of the year, just before the flood, or he got killed in the flood, meaning that of the people who were righteous and took God seriously
Right.
and got on the ark
Right.
for God's mercy,
Yeah.
he thought they were all loonies and got
Maybe
killed
he
in the
didn't.
flood.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
So there's only two options there, but it's interesting. Hence, I put it on a chart for you. So,
Everybody else was dead before.
Yeah.
what happens following the flood is this sets up a pattern that you'll see between descendants and then their generations. And what happens is Noah has 3 sons. One of his sons, Ham, who his descendants are the people of Canaan. Noah, unfortunately, gets drunk, falls asleep, naked in his tent, and Ham discovers him that way. And he doesn't cover up his father, and runs off to tell his brothers, dude, you should go, like, you gotta go what happened to Dad. His 2 other brothers, they walk in and grab a cloak, and they walk in backward, so that way they don't even see their father, to give their father that respect, and they cover him. When Noah wakes up and realizes what happened, and the fact that Ham found it so funny, he pronounces essentially a prophecy on Ham's descendants about the wickedness and immorality that the Canaanites would have. This was not Noah punishing Ham's son for what Ham did. This was a prophecy and a realization that Ham's bent toward this behavior was going to be exemplified in his descendants, because what you do, we've heard the saying, what you do, your children will do more. Ham had a bent toward, oh, this is funny, this kind of behavior and such. So Noah recognized and put forward the prophecy that is going to cause his descendants trouble. So you have your first split toward people who are chosen, of people who are walking in that favor of God and where their legacy would lead, and where a legacy outside of God was going to lead.
Election.
Mm-hmm. So,
Too bad he didn't take that the other way around, and you know what I mean. And
take what the other way around it.
just instead of trying to get upset with him and prophesize some not so great things for his. He could have, I don't know, tried to write that.
Well,
but
that's the thing.
Yeah.
With it being prophecy,
Right.
it was what was revealed to him. It was a revelation of this is the path
Yeah.
that he has now set up for his children, and their children, and their children, and their children.
Yeah, awful.
So he spoke it out. Prophecy, that's where prophecy differs from how other religions and other cults, including the Old Testament, viewed prophecy. They viewed prophecy typically paired with rituals as a way to manipulate God and manipulate the future. So what you were saying was a prophecy was a spell on the future, and a spell on time,
Yeah.
and a spell on events.
Yeah.
For mankind, people with God, prophecy was them speaking out a revelation that they were given. Prophecy was not them affecting or changing. It was more them speaking and having a realization of this is how the laws of God, the laws of the world that he put in motion, how they work, and this is a revelation about them.
Yeah.
And that's the major difference between the two.
Yeah. He's laying it down from the beginning.
So this one is fun. For those of you online, I'm hoping you can see them well. If anything, you'll be able to pull up the digital slides and pull up the pictures. So these are pictures of ancient ziggurat structures. And I'll show you why they're up there in just a moment. As we move toward Genesis 11, a lot of time has gone by. You see the table of nations and whose children are going to become whose nations at this point in time. And we arrive at the story of the Tower of Babel. Mm-hmm. God had, again, he gave man a directive. He wanted them to spread out and to multiply and to cover the earth. This is part of really one of the earlier directives that he gave Adam to subjugate the earth and bring it under dominion, which is now even more important than ever considering that the curse has fallen. And now authority really has to be exerted because things aren't going to be automatic and easy. But the group of people at Babel, they decide to move themselves in direct opposition to this directive. What they end up doing is an act of rebellion. They'd been commanded to spread out, but they decided that they were going to come together and strengthen their identity as who they were. They wanted to be famous. They wanted to be huge. They wanted to be recognized. In truth, it was open rebellion against God, and more than that, it was a declaration of independence from God. What they didn't do in obedience, God did through judgment. He scrambled up their language, and by their languages being scrambled, it forced them to scatter and spread apart and keep with their likes of whom, oh, this person understands me, I know what you're saying, and spread out. So what they tried, God turned around and said, nope, my will is still going to be fulfilled, and you're still going to spread out. So the reason I have these ziggurats is because from what scholars have determined about Babylon is that the Tower of Babel was a ziggurat. And what a ziggurat is it is the center of worship in a city. And it's a temple with a high god and a high temple situated at the very top. Its naming essentially is a tower of stairs. So the higher you climbed, you went into higher realms of glory, presence, temple, whatever, until you went ahead and got to the top. They're wanting to build their tower to the heavens was their way of, we are going to reach deity by our strength, on our own, because we cannot be stopped. This narrative by the original writers was used as a polemic, which is a strong verbal or written attack on someone, something, or some belief. So it's essentially a rebuttal. And it's a rebuttal against the traditions about the city of Babylon, because the Babylonians say that the construction of their glorious city of Babylon began in the heavens, and the bricks were brought down, which is why all the bricks were inscribed with the name of Marduk, their god. This attests to the fact that the origin of the city of Babylon, because Babel did become Babylon, that the origin of Babylon was not this divine glory thing that put them at the center of the world. They thought they were the center of the world. But much to the contrary, it was a man-made effort that failed because it was in opposition to the actual God. So the top left and bottom right photos, so top left with the dude standing in front, and over here an aerial view of it, these are of the ziggurat at Ur. So Ur is near where Abraham lived. So this would be a ziggurat that he likely could have potentially seen in his day. The other two, these are what the bottom left is what is left of, and the top right, what people have interpreted it could have looked like in its day. The world's tallest ziggurat in a lamb, which people believe to potentially be the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. If what you see here on the bottom left is 335 feet, which archaeologists believe is less than half of its estimated full height. They believe it was about 700 feet tall, a 70-story structure.
Wow.
So
How did they get that high?
Yeah. Wow.
a lot of work. It tells you like how much, what these people decided to work on tells you where their heart was. Noah works on the ark for 100 years. His heart is going toward a project of redemption and of salvation. This is a project of pride. Of pride.
Pride.
Yeah. So if you're working on that for that long, this shows you that where their heart is,
God isn't.
is opposite of where God was. So you can tell about these people by what they worked on. So from there, Genesis introduces us to the patriarchal period. That's named after your patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So from here, as God is moving forward in his redemption plan for his chosen people, who are going to represent him to all these nations, which are now spread out and are becoming very distinct nations, he's going to call and set apart a specific family to become a specific nation set apart for him. So God calls Abram. He sets him apart unto this mission, and he has him move from his homeland and from his family at Ur to where he's calling him. What's cool is that we read that in Haran, a good number of souls were acquired by Abram. This acquiring of people, if you're looking at the text and looking at the context, as scholars have looked over this, is not referring to his having children, and it's not the typical way you would refer to someone acquiring servants. In the same passage, God uses the verb make in the sense of make you a great nation. What people infer then is that this reference of making souls refers to Abraham's influence on people to join him in following God's call in this new venture. That he acquires a body of people who also see the vision. So when they talk about then, from that point, Abraham and the people with him, there are people who are his servants, there are people who are his relatives, and there are people who simply caught the vision and said, yes, we'll follow God with you. God brings Abraham through an up and downs of figuring out and learning about faith and relationship and trusting him, some of which are passed and some of which are failed. One of the first ones we see is Abram and his wife Sarah are in Egypt. And while they're there in Egypt, the Bible tells us that Sarah was a very beautiful woman, so beautiful in fact that Abram was worried that he would be killed if people knew that he was her husband. He was worried that people would kill him so that way they could claim his wife and take her away. So he decided to concoct this scheme and speak a half-truth, claiming that his wife was his sister. The thing is, she is actually, technically, his half-sister. So it's not a total lie. It's misleading. It's a total deception. But he probably took some comfort in the fact that it was truth. And it's likely based on the custom of his day in which the brother arranged the marriage of his sister. So if someone was attracted to Sarah, they would have to talk to him about it. And when she would then find out, be able to prepare, do something, and they could skip town and get out of there. If he was the husband, he was afraid he was just going to get jumped and killed.
Yeah.
What he didn't plan on was that it was going to be the Pharaoh of Egypt who was interested in his wife, who Pharaoh believed to be his sister. And the Pharaoh did not need to negotiate with the brother. He simply went ahead and had her brought to the palace. The problem now is that the promise is in jeopardy. God has not spoken. They have no idea that they're about to have a son who is going to then have a son and is going to lead into a nation. They don't know this yet, but God does and knows that can't happen. It needs to be you and Abraham's son, not Sarah's and Pharaoh's son. So now this deception has to be addressed. And sadly, as we saw, there are things that generations would carry. Deception was about to become a family trait as things went forward. When you read the story, it almost looks like that Abram prospers from his deception because he walks away with a lot of riches. But in truth, these riches were going to be a reminder of how he almost lost his wife. Anytime that he looked at this, it was going, if anyone asked, oh, where did you get that? It's going to be a reminder of this situation and how responding out of fear almost cost him the person that mattered the most to him. And it was about to turn into a period of strife because as the wealth is split up, Lot's servants and farmers and shepherds and all that start getting into conflict with Abram's, and it's so bad that the best solution seems to be for Abram to split up and part ways with Lot, his nephew. So Abram, which this exemplifies just absolute trust in the plan of God. They look out and they go up on this high point and they look out over all the land they could see. And Abraham asks Lot to go ahead and choose what area he would like to settle in with his company. And Lot chooses the best parts of the land for himself. Abram has such faith in God that it doesn't matter what Lot takes because Abram is waiting on God. Therefore, he's able to be generous because he has faith. It doesn't worry him, it doesn't concern him whatsoever. And the choice that Lot makes is going to cost him because he chooses to settle by Sodom and Gomorrah. And at this point in time, Sodom was already an extremely wicked city. This did not deter him. And Lot starts by living on the outskirts, on the fields near Sodom. But eventually we'll find that he's moved into Sodom as the pull drew him in. Shortly after they split up, something else begins to happen where you start to see favor over Abram as it comes to victory. There ends up being this crazy scenario where you have 4 kings mobilized to fight 5 other kings, so 4 on 5, 9 kings altogether decide to go ahead and go to war. The army of 4, the villains of the story, attacking the army of 5. In that army of 5 is the king of Sodom and the king of Gomorrah. The army of 5 loses, and they are ransacked with the wives, the children, and the possessions taken away by the winning 4 armies. Lot and his family are among the people taken. One of Lot's servants escapes and tells Abram what's happened. So Abram then mobilizes the forces in his household, which was 318 trained men trained warriors born in his household, and some neighbors and their friends, some Amorites who lived nearby. He lived near on their property, and he grabs them and their families too. And they go ahead and go to war. What's amazing is this, when you guys read through my notes, you'll see that certain things, if they're me, essentially if this is revelations that God has given me, if I've been reading this, they're marked my notes, and then other things are tagged saying Cornerstone Commentary and then the page. Cornerstone Commentary are books that look like this. They are an incredible commentary resource that I've used in writing this course and in other courses. And the reason I like them so much is they are spirit-filled. They look at the whole picture of the Bible. It's written by people who actually believe the Bible is true, which should not be shocking, but it is shocking. And rather than go verse by verse or chapter by chapter, which can sometimes be too much to swallow, they take the Bible piece by piece. So you'll have a section of scripture followed by notes that break out words that may mean something different than they're translated in the NLT, because it's based out of the NLT. And then you have the commentary where these people then discuss what these things mean that you just read. Back and forth that way. It helps you stay in the moment. It's super easy to follow, and it has incredible resources.
So how do they do that? They write one for for the law, and then for the history, and then for poetry, or how do they, or they just do Old Testament, New Testament?
So they have the entire Old and New Testament. So this volume covers Genesis and Exodus.
Oh.
So they break it up.
Okay.
And what you would see here is,
So you're gonna need the whole
so I have in front
set.
of me, you have in scripture, Genesis chapter 40, verses 1 through 23. Any notes about some of the verses or words in Genesis chapter 40, verses 1 through 23. And then the commentary, where now they walk through and describe what that means in incorporating those notes and comparing them to what you just read before as for context. So that way you can really dive deep into everything that you're reading.
Right.
So
is that common for them to just do a couple of books per
book?
Yeah.
From what I can
Just
see, it
snippets.
depends. Sometimes there's some comprehensive commentaries that are either a really big volume or just a really fast summary. These are attempting to mine out everything that can be found. So there's a good portion of books.
Yeah.
And they all have, 1 to 2, maybe 3, not really many more typically, unless they're the epistles within each volume itself. But you can look them up, and if there's a favorite book of the Bible of yours, you can get the volume that has that book in it to start, and now you've got a fun resource
help
to
to break
explore
it
it
down.
further.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Really helped to break it down, and that was Cornerstone.
They are the Cornerstone Biblical Commentaries, and they're published by Tyndale.
Tyndale.
Mm-hmm. And they're by various different scholars, and these people all reference many other scholars and have all their works in the back. So what that tells you is that these are not only learned men, but they are pulling the truth out of many other learned men.
Cornerstone Biblical Commentaries.
Yep,
Okay.
that is correct. So something pulled from this book that they pulled out is that in this record, in this situation, Abram is presented as the Hebrew force to be reckoned with in the ancient world. He's in fact known as the Hebrew in Genesis chapter 14, verse 13. Apparently a description used of him by various kings and tribal chieftains of the day. This is part of the beginning of the outworking of God's promise to make Abram great and to bless those who bless him, including curse those who curse him. So the people who joined themselves with Abram that day found victory. This small contingent, Abram had him and 318 guys, and I don't know how big the family was of his neighbors, probably not more than 318 trained warriors to be sure. If they all had 318 people, then we'll say that they had 1,300 people altogether. And they take on and defeat an army of 4 kings in the middle of the night. This is a supernatural, miraculous occurrence, but they get all the possessions back, they get all the relatives, the wives and children back, and they restore them to the kings and the cities that were lost. And on the way coming home, Abram comes up against another test of faith. One of the people in the area, Melchizedek, who is entitled as a priest of the Most High God. Abram recognizes him as an authority, and he essentially tithes and gives him the 10% of what was plundered, and receives a blessing. On the other hand, when Abram then deals with Sodom's king Bera, Bera wants his people back and tells Abram that he can keep a portion of the loot that was taken from Sodom. Abraham refuses. Abram tells him that he does not want it to look like Bera made him rich. This is not a thing out of pride of, I want to say, earn this on my own dime. He knows the wickedness in the heart of that king, and where he freely gave and aligned himself with Melchizedek, knowing God's favor was on him. This is a man of God. In the case of Bera, he did not want anything that created an alliance or a tie between them, because he knew you are not among God's people and on God's side, and it is vital for me to protect and keep set apart.
Separation.
Then we step into God's covenant with Abram. This takes place in chapter 15. At this point in time, Abram has started to worry about the fact that he does not have a descendant yet. And as he's talking to God and attempting to come up with a plan, essentially to adopt and raise up his loyal servant to the status of a son and make him his son, God promises him and tells him that won't be necessary because you are actually going to have a son who is of your own blood with your wife. As confirmation of this and of his faithfulness, God makes a covenant with Abram and his descendants. He declares that Abram's descendants, and this is where prophecy comes in, it's a revelation of truth, no matter what that truth entails. This could sound like a bad piece, but it's going to provide hope in the future. In the process of things that God tells him about his promise, that you will have a son, which is incredible for Abram to hear. He also tells him that his children will turn into a great nation, as numerous as the stars, more than he can count, in greatness, and that they'll actually end up being slaves in a foreign land for 400 years. And this has multiple reasons. God is going to give Abram's descendants the land of Canaan. God tells Abram this. But he also tells them that they're not going to have the land of Canaan immediately, because God is giving the people of Canaan a chance for redemption, and their sins have not essentially met the level to where them being removed from their land would be justified. God is not going to do this and wipe them out just so that way his favorite people can have their land. It's going to be a response to the people of Canaan's own sin that results in them being exiled. And because that has not happened yet, and their sins have not reached that point where that's necessary yet, Israel is not going to possess Canaan yet. At the same time, Israel will end up being oppressed by a foreign land for 400 years, but that oppression will not go unanswered. This is then a part of giving Abram hope of, yes, your people will be oppressed for 400 years, your descendants, but I will come out in justice. I will free them. I will liberate them. Not only will the oppressing nation pay, and face judgment for turning against God's people, but Israel, your descendants will walk away with great wealth when they leave. And then they will come to Canaan. After sunset, God reveals himself with the image of a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch. You can see this in chapter 15, verse 17. These are objects that are connected with sacrificial ritual in the ancient world. Fire represents the consuming, cleansing zeal of the Lord, as well as his approachable holiness, and they're both using that idea of smoke and fire. It's an image and a symbol that God would use in his relationship with his people throughout his time with the descendants as an image of his glory. The covenant that he makes with Abram is, once again, it's a unilateral covenant. It's a covenant initiated by God, and its promises are 100% sure because they do not depend on Abraham and Abraham's actions or his descendants' actions whatsoever. Once again, God is the initiator. He's in the process of redeeming a people who are unfaithful to him, and yet says, I love you so much, and I have such great things in store for you. I want to restore and redeem humanity in the future, but I want you to be a partner with me, which means you get blessed by it. I receive glory, but I want you to receive blessing. And therefore, I make a smaller covenant now that is on Abram and his descendants and his family. And I think that's a good stopping point. So before we wrap up, any questions or thoughts on any of that stuff that we've discussed so far before the pause?
Adult story time.
Did you write this yourself?
Yes. Obviously not this.
No, I'm saying you're actually giving a description of this history as though you wrote these books yourself. It's that well presented.
Wonderful.
I did my research. If you can see my end of the screen, There is more notes than I can read. I highlighted everything that was essential for that core thought and idea. The hardest part about researching stuff like this is you find 1,000 facts that are extremely interesting, but they're not always all relevant to the core of the class, and it is painful to not put them in there. What you guys have for your quizzes to go through this is you get the benefit of there is about 2/3 more in all of these notes than what I'm telling you in class right now. As far as what words mean and different revelations, I am, because of time and because of which is honestly good for the heart of this class, I'm picking the things that are essential to God's relationship with humanity, because that is ultimately what these 5 books are telling. That is why Moses wrote them, to record for all the future generations, because Moses is the author of all 5 of these books. So I'm sticking in line with Moses' intention in writing these. Overall, they all have their subcategories and different chapters for different things, but overall, this is recording God's initial relationship with man, how it was affected, and how far God would go to reestablish it, because he was not going to let his children go. So my facts are funneled into that core idea, and when there's time for extras or things during the breaks, we'll go for it. That's why you guys have all the access to my notes, and why the quizzes are based out of that. That way you still get the chance to see everything, and with the quizzes being related to them, they'll really stick in your memory. So with that, we'll go ahead and we'll take our first break, and we'll start at 8 o'clock sharp.